So again, we'll just make it a conversation. The first thing I wanted to talk about is, do you think this is a burglary or a kidnapping? And I want to start with you, Dr. Jordan.
I'm going to geek out on you for starters and remind you that a burglary is breaking and entering with the intent to commit any felony. So by default, it's a burglary. The question is, what was the felony that was in mind when the intruder went in there? So in other words, was it about a larceny? Was it about stealing belongings in the home? Could it have been about a sexual assault? Could it have been planned for homicide or for a kidnapping? I mean, there's many different possibilities of why that person entered that home. So it was a burglary, and I happen to believe at this stage of the game that it is more likely than unlikely that the initial, and I know I'm going to be disagreed with, the initial motivation was probably theft instead of kidnapping. I think that the abduction happened after the fact, after something went terribly wrong.
What do you think, Dr. Burgess? Because nothing was taken from the home.
Right, nothing was taken from the home, and of course we don't have the crime scene to look at, which is very much a disadvantage. But I think there's another motive that they went in for, and before long it went south, is what I think. I don't think they were there to steal anything.
There is a communication, a message, delivered through channels that investigators have not publicly detailed, received sometime after the night Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. And what that message said has not been fully reconciled with a single other element of this investigation. It said, "I am sorry. We did not expect her heart to be that weak." Read that again. Not as a headline, not as a detail scrolled past in a news update. Read it as what it actually is, a forensic artifact. A communication that contains within its 10 words a set of implications so structurally significant that 3 of the most credentialed minds in American forensic science spent considerable time attempting to make sense of what it reveals, about the person who wrote it. Because here is what that message is not. It is not a demand. It is not a threat. It is not the language of power, of leverage, of a negotiation being conducted from a position of control. Every documented ransom communication in the FBI's behavioral analysis files, everyone is built on the assertion of power. We have something you want. Here is what it costs to get it back. That is the grammar of abduction for ransom. That has always been the grammar of abduction for ransom. What arrived in the Nancy Guthrie case was not that grammar. What arrived was an apology, a statement of surprise, a declaration that the outcome was unintended, a message suggesting that whoever sent it encountered something they were not prepared for and felt or wanted the recipient to believe they felt something adjacent to regret. And those two possibilities are not equivalent. Because if the apology is authentic, it leads to a specific category of perpetrator, a specific psychological profile, a specific theory of what happened inside that home. And if the apology is manufactured, if it is a calculated piece of misdirection assembled by someone who understood precisely what effect those words would have on the person reading them, it leads to a different perpetrator, a different profile, a different theory entirely. Both paths are being held simultaneously by a panel of experts whose collective expertise spans 4 decades of work in forensic psychiatry, criminal behavioral analysis, and the statistical study of violent crime. They sat down and did what official statements rarely permit. They named the categories the evidence most supports. They described the behavioral profile that the totality of what is known about this case most closely resembles. And they reached a consensus not about a specific individual, but about the architecture of this crime. About the kind of mind that would have designed it, executed it, and then watched the aftermath unfold. What follows is a forensic reconstruction of that analysis, not a retelling of events the audience already knows. A methodical, evidence-weighted examination of what the experts' conclusions actually mean and why those conclusions challenge almost everything that has dominated public conversation about this case. Welcome to True Crime Hex. This channel is dedicated to investigating the cases that demand more than a headline. If you are new here, welcome. The standard on this channel is evidence. The standard is precision. The standard is not looking away until there are answers. This case demands all 3. And the panel's analysis is where this investigation now lives. The 3 experts whose work forms the foundation of this analysis are not commentators. They are not journalists. They are not practitioners of the kind of speculative theorizing that has flooded the internet in the weeks and months since Nancy Guthrie disappeared. They are forensic psychiatrists and behavioral analysts whose professional lives have been spent in the company of violent crime, classifying it, understanding it, and translating its logic for law enforcement and courts. one brings a background in forensic psychiatry and the behavioral classification of violent offenders, with decades of experience working alongside investigators on cases involving abduction, homicide, and staged crime scenes. Another is one of the most published authorities on victimology in the country, meaning the scientific study of victims, of what their selection tells us about perpetrators, and of the behavioral patterns that distinguish one category of violent crime from another. The third brings a statistical lens that is, in this case, essential, a clinical specialization in the epidemiology of abduction, the actual numbers behind a crime type that is, as will become clear, far rarer and far more specific in its profile than most people understand. What distinguishes their methodology from the noise surrounding this case is not credentials alone. It is rigor. They are not working backward from a preferred conclusion. They are working forward from a specific question. What does the evidence, including the evidence of what is conspicuously absent, most support? What category of crime does the totality of observable behavior most closely resemble? And where does that category point in terms of perpetrator type, motive, and investigative priority? The answer they arrive at is not comfortable, but it is careful. And careful is the only thing that serves Nancy Guthrie now. The first structural question the panel confronts is one that sounds deceptively simple. Was this event a burglary, or was it a kidnapping? And the reason this question is not merely semantic, not just a matter of terminology, is that the classification fundamentally determines the investigative roadmap. Different crime categories produce different forensic signatures, different suspect profiles, different behavioral predictions, and different priorities for investigators working the scene and the evidence. Getting the classification wrong at the outset of an investigation is one of the most consequential and most common errors an investigative team can make. It sends resources in the wrong direction. It generates leads that go nowhere, and it allows the actual explanation to remain invisible while the investigation chases a category it was never in. Here is how forensic science actually defines burglary, not as common usage defines it, not as the word conjures in the popular imagination. In behavioral and legal terms, burglary is breaking and entering with the intent to commit any felony, not theft specifically, any felony. A person who enters a home intending to commit a sexual assault is, by definition, a burglar. A person who enters intending to commit a homicide is, by definition, a burglar. The word theft is not embedded in the legal or behavioral definition of the term. The word felony is, and that distinction reshapes the question entirely. So when the panel asks whether this was a burglary, they are not asking whether someone came to steal Nancy Guthrie's jewelry or electronics. They are asking whether someone entered her home with the intention to commit a crime, any crime, and whether the events that followed were consistent with that intention or diverged from it in ways that reveal something essential about what actually happened. One member of the panel opens with the hypothesis that the initial motivation was most likely theft and that the situation escalated into something else when something went terribly wrong. This is a familiar and forensically credible scenario. Residential burglaries do turn violent. An experienced burglar selects what they believe is an unoccupied property, enters, encounters an occupant they did not anticipate, and the dynamic of the encounter shifts in ways that escalate beyond anything the perpetrator intended. Violence follows. Abduction, in some cases, follows violence as an improvised response to a deteriorating situation. But here is where the panel's analysis fractures along a line that matters, because the counterpoint to the theft hypothesis is quiet, precise, and forensically devastating. Nothing was taken from the home, not one item that the family has identified as missing, not electronics, not jewelry, not cash, not the category of portable, high-value items that burglars experienced or amateur characteristically prioritize. Nothing was taken. One panelist immediately qualifies that finding with appropriate scientific caution. We do not know with certainty that nothing was taken, they observe. A family in acute crisis in the hours after discovering that a loved one has vanished does not conduct a systematic, comprehensive inventory of their property. There may be items that are missing and have not been cataloged yet. That is a responsible point. It is also true, but it must sit beside a harder observation. Even granting the possibility of unidentified missing items, the behavior, documented on the surveillance footage, the 42 minutes of footage that investigators have reviewed in detail, does not resemble the behavioral signature of someone who entered this home to steal from. It does not show a systematic search of the premises. It does not show someone assessing and gathering valuables, loading items into a bag, working through rooms with the purposeful efficiency of someone conducting a theft. It shows something else, something that multiple members of this panel describe as deliberate, controlled, and purposeful in a way that the theft hypothesis does not adequately explain. The third member of the panel introduces the statistical dimension at this point in the analysis, and the statistics are not what most people expect them to be. Adult abductions, meaning the forcible taking of an adult from their home or known location by an unknown or unfamiliar perpetrator, are not simply uncommon. They are extraordinary in their rarity. The documented figure sits at approximately 350 cases per year across the entire United States, not 3,500. 350. In a country of 330 million people, the category of crime that this case is most commonly described as represents 350 incidents annually, and within that already vanishingly small number, the distribution is not uniform. The vast majority of abductions, statistically, involve children, not adults. The subset involving adults is smaller. The subset involving adults taken from their primary residence by someone operating outside their social network is smaller still. These cases exist. They are documented. They are investigated. But they are not the default, ordinary category of violent crime that the word abduction implies when it appears in a news headline. Why does this matter? Because rarity demands justification. If adult residential abductions are statistically exceptional, then classifying this case as one in the absence of evidence that actively and specifically supports that classification requires a higher evidentiary threshold than classification in a more common category would require. The investigation cannot simply assume that the most dramatic explanation is the correct one because it is the most visible one. Rarity has to be earned by the evidence, and the panel turns to examine what the evidence actually shows: the 42 minutes of footage, the behavioral record left behind by whoever was in and around Nancy Guthrie's home in the early morning hours of January 31st, the physical evidence on the porch, the state of the home, what is present, what is absent, and what the combination of those things most supports. The forensic assessment of the perpetrator captured on camera is, in the panel's view, unequivocal. This is not a professional, not even by the loosest definition of the term. The specific behavioral indicators cited are worth examining carefully because each one carries diagnostic weight beyond its surface appearance. The firearm this individual carries does not match the holster they are wearing. This is not an aesthetic detail. Holsters are engineered for specific weapons, designed around precise barrel lengths, grip dimensions, slide widths, and weight distributions. A holster built for a compact semi-automatic does not function correctly with a full-frame service weapon. It does not retain the weapon securely. It interferes with draw speed and stability. It is physically uncomfortable for the carrier. These are not abstract inconveniences, they are operational problems that anyone with experience carrying a weapon as part of their professional function would never create. The mismatch tells the panel something specific. The firearm and the holster were assembled by someone for whom neither is a familiar tool. Someone who gathered this equipment, possibly recently, possibly from multiple sources without the operational background to know that the components are incompatible. Someone for whom the weapon is, in a precise behavioral sense, a prop, an element of costume that serves a psychological function, intimidation, authority, without being functionally integrated into how this person actually operates. Add to this the manner in which the weapon is being carried. The panel notes that it is worn in a way that is inconsistent with any recognizable tactical training. This is not someone who has drilled on weapon retention, on drawing from concealment, on maintaining weapon security during a physical altercation. This is someone approximating what that looks like from outside the training environment, mimicking the appearance of capability without possessing it. And then there is the camera. The surveillance camera outside Nancy Guthrie's home. The perpetrator is aware of it. They know it is there. And the method they employ to address it is, and this is the precise clinical term the panel uses, amateur. They hold vegetation, pieces of foliage, plant material, in front of the lens. They wave it in the camera's field of view as if visual obstruction of the image is equivalent to defeating the surveillance system entirely, not disabling the camera, not physically destroying it, not employing the kind of face-obscuring concealment that prevents identification regardless of camera angle or footage quality. Plant material, held in front of a lens. This behavioral signature, this particular improvised response to a known surveillance threat, tells investigators something of genuine value. It tells them that this person understands enough about surveillance to know that cameras exist and are a problem. And it tells them that this person does not understand enough about surveillance to counter it with any effectiveness. The gap between those 2 points is a gap in operational knowledge, a gap that belongs to the amateur. The person who thought about surveillance cameras in the way that someone thinks about a problem they have never actually solved before, hit the like button on this video. Every like on this content is a signal that this story is reaching people who care, and it is how responsible, evidence-based coverage of Nancy Guthrie's case continues to reach further. Hit like now, and then stay with this, because the analysis is about to move into territory that the news cycle has not adequately addressed. One panelist introduces a concept at this point that deserves extended consideration. They call it beginner's luck. The idea that the amateurism of this perpetrator, the mismatched equipment, the improvised camera obstruction, the absence of recognizable professional technique may have functioned, paradoxically, as a protective factor rather than a liability. Here is the forensic logic behind that counterintuitive observation. An experienced, professional perpetrator carries a recognizable behavioral signature. They have methods, they have contacts. They have a history of criminal activity that has generated documentary and forensic traces, arrests, associates, known locations, patterns of behavior that can be identified and connected across cases. Experience in crime, like experience in anything else, produces patterns, and patterns are visible. Patterns can be analyzed, cataloged, and matched. They generate investigative leads. An amateur, operating on panic and improvisation, produces something different. They produce a crime scene that does not conform to any established pattern, that does not fit neatly into a behavioral category that investigators can search against known databases. That was assembled from moment to moment, under extreme pressure, by someone who had not done this before and was making decisions in real time without the benefit of prior experience or established protocol. The result is paradoxically harder to analyze, precisely because it contains no repeating signature, no identifiable method, no connection to prior criminal activity that a database search can surface. Beginner's luck is not a comforting concept, but it is an honest one, and it matters for understanding why this investigation has not produced a rapid resolution despite the availability of substantial camera footage, physical evidence, and communication records. But there is one element of the behavioral profile on camera that the panel cannot reconcile with the amateur framework, and that element is perhaps the most forensically significant of all. This person is calm, not agitated, not panicked, not demonstrating the hypervigilant, hyperkinetic behavioral response that characterizes the typical amateur perpetrator engaged in a high-stakes crime in real time. The word the panel uses is remarkable coolness under pressure, and the panel does not let that observation pass without interrogation, because calm is not a neutral behavioral data point. Calm is diagnostic. It tells you something specific about what the person on camera believes their situation to be in the moment they are being recorded. Two explanations emerge. The first, by the time the perpetrator appeared on camera, the critical, dangerous event was already over. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie inside that home had already happened. She was already, in some state, unconscious, incapacitated, deceased that meant she could no longer resist, respond, or create unpredictable risk. And if that is true, then the person on camera is not committing the crime. They are managing the aftermath of it, staging, controlling the scene. And staging is a purposeful, methodical activity that does not require the fight or flight arousal of someone actively engaged in violence. Staging is work, and this person is working. The second explanation is darker. The second explanation does not require that the crime is already complete. It requires only that the person capable of committing it is not the kind of person who experiences the emotional interference that most human beings experience when they are doing something terrifying and irreversible. The panel uses a specific clinical term for this. They describe it as a psychopathic character structure, and they use that term with precision, not as a synonym for evil, not as a casual descriptor for someone who has done something terrible. As a specific clinical pattern, the capacity for high-stakes, high-consequence action without the emotional disruption that typically accompanies it. The absence of the fear response. The absence of the remorse signal. The absence of the physiological experience of danger that most human beings cannot suppress even when they want to. Both of those explanations lead to the same investigative conclusion. The person on camera, whatever their emotional architecture, operated with a level of control that is inconsistent with a spontaneous, panic-driven escalation from an attempted burglary. That level of control requires either that the dangerous work was done before the camera recorded them, or that they are the kind of person for whom dangerous work does not produce observable emotional disruption. Neither option supports the accidental burglary hypothesis. Both options point towards something more deliberate. Now return to the communications, the ransom demands, and the note that continues to resist clean interpretation. The panel does not treat any single communication in isolation. They treat the full pattern of contacts, multiple demands, multiple attempts at what functions on its surface as a ransom negotiation, as a behavioral dataset, and their assessment of that dataset is direct, without qualification. They do not believe any of the ransom demands were legitimate. That conclusion requires careful unpacking because not legitimate contains several distinct meanings, and which meaning applies here determines everything about what these communications actually reveal. Not legitimate could mean that the person or persons making the demand never had Nancy Guthrie at all, that they were opportunistic actors, exploiting a high-profile disappearance for financial gain. This is a documented and deeply cynical category of behavior. High-profile missing persons cases attract a specific subset of the population that attempts to profit from family desperation by manufacturing the appearance of contact with a perpetrator they have no actual connection to. This is not hypothetical. It happens. It has happened in cases with far less public visibility than this one. Not legitimate could also mean that the person making the demands had some knowledge, not direct involvement, but access to information about the case, and was using that partial knowledge as leverage. A neighbor who saw something. Someone with a professional connection to the home who had information they converted into a financial opportunity. Someone operating at the margins of this event who understood that the appearance of inside knowledge was, in this context, valuable, or not legitimate could mean something that the panel treats with equal seriousness. It could mean that the communications were designed not primarily to extract money, but to control the experience of the person receiving them, to direct attention, to generate a specific emotional response in a specific individual, to demonstrate, to an audience that may be as small as one person, that the sender has the capacity to reach into Savannah Guthrie's world and rearrange it according to their will. One panelist states it in terms that are as clear as anything in this analysis. The demands feel less about real money and more about the attention, and then they add a phrase that captures something important about the psychological profile on display. Puppet master. Look what I can do. The power that comes not from the extraction of financial resources, but from the demonstration of reach. From proving to themselves and to the person on the other end of these messages that they have the ability to cause harm, to create fear, to generate consequences in a life they have chosen as their target. That kind of communication is not a negotiation. It is a performance. And performances of that kind are associated with a specific psychological profile, the power and control orientation. The person for whom the exercise of authority is the end, not the means. For whom knowing that someone is suffering because of something they set in motion is, in itself, the goal. Now examine the apology against that framework. I am sorry. We did not expect her heart to be that weak. If the communication came from a person with a power and control orientation, from someone who understands themselves to be performing, to be demonstrating capability, to be orchestrating the emotional experience of the recipient, then an apology is deeply inconsistent. It is an admission of loss of control. It is an acknowledgement that the outcome diverged from the intent. It is the kind of statement that a person invested in the performance of omnipotence does not make, because it ruptures the performance. It exposes the gap between what was planned and what occurred, and a person operating from a power and control framework does not voluntarily expose that gap, so the panel is left with a problem. The apology does not fit the profile suggested by the ransom communication pattern, and the ransom communication pattern does not fit the content of the apology. They come from the same case. They may not come from the same person. Two possibilities emerge from this tension. The first, the apology is authentic, and it came from someone on the periphery of this event, a secondary participant who did not fully anticipate what they were agreeing to, who encountered the reality of what happened to Nancy Guthrie and experienced something that the primary orchestrator of this event almost certainly did not experience. Remorse, or at least something recognizable as its predecessor. The second, the apology was manufactured. It was assembled by someone who understood precisely what effect those specific words, I am sorry. We did not expect her heart to be that weak would have on the person reading them. It was designed to appear authentic, to produce in Savannah Guthrie the particular torment of a communication that seems too specific, too intimate, too psychologically accurate to be a fabrication, and it accomplished that goal. One panelist notes that Savannah reportedly considers this communication authentic, that observation matters not as evidence in the forensic sense, but as data. Because Savannah Guthrie is not a naive observer, she is a journalist by training and professional practice. She has spent decades developing the ability to evaluate the credibility of sources and statements. And if this communication, with its quiet, strange, almost intimate quality, reads as authentic to the person who knows Nancy best and who has the strongest incentive in the world to detect manipulation, that instinct is worth noting. Not as proof, as data. The panel does not resolve this tension, it holds it. And that refusal to collapse ambiguity into a comfortable answer is where rigorous analysis lives. If this analysis is reaching you, and you believe Nancy Guthrie deserves the kind of coverage that refuses to look away, subscribe to True Crime Hex, and hit the like button on this video. Every subscriber is a signal that evidence-based, responsible true crime coverage has an audience that demands something better than speculation. Subscribe now. There is more in this analysis that the news cycle has not touched, and it is where the real investigative weight of this case lives. There is a term that one panelist introduces into this discussion that carries more forensic significance than any other single concept in the analysis. It is not a term from popular crime culture. It is not a phrase designed for emotional impact. It is a behavioral classification, a category with specific defining characteristics, a specific investigative logic, and a specific set of implications for where the answer to this case most likely lies. The term is elimination murder. An elimination murder is an event, a killing, or an event intended to result in a killing in which the victim is not the primary object of grievance. The victim is not the person the perpetrator is fundamentally in conflict with. The victim is, in the precise language of the classification, an impediment. Someone whose existence prevents the perpetrator from reaching something they want, maintaining something they have, or resolving a situation that is unresolved because that person is alive. The category is broader than it sounds, and that breadth is important. The impediment does not have to be dramatic or obvious. It does not have to be a witness to a crime or a rival for an inheritance, though those are documented varieties of the category. The impediment can be something quieter. A family member whose age or health condition creates an ongoing caretaking obligation that someone in their orbit resents not openly, not in ways that are visible to the outside world, but in the deep, private accounting that people conduct when they believe no one is watching. A person who possesses knowledge not of a crime, but of a relationship, a financial situation, a personal history that someone needs to remain undisclosed. A partner whose connection to a family member blocks the progression of a relationship that the perpetrator wants to advance. A person who, through no particular fault of their own, simply exists in a way that interferes with something that someone else needs. The panel outlines 5 specific categories of motive within the elimination murder framework. The first is financial, someone whose death transfers resources, removes a financial obligation, or clears a path to an inheritance. The second is romantic, someone whose death resolves a relationship entanglement, eliminates a rival for affection, or removes an obstacle to a partnership the perpetrator wants. The third is what might be called caretaking burden, someone whose dependence has become, in the perpetrator's private calculus, a weight they have decided they are no longer willing to carry. The fourth is knowledge, someone who knows something that the perpetrator needs to remain unknown. The fifth is circumstantial, someone who walked in on something, who saw something they were not meant to see, who became, through accident or timing, a liability. Nancy Guthrie, at 84 years of age, belongs to more than one of these categories in theory. The financial category cannot be ruled out without access to estate planning documents and financial relationships that the investigation has not publicly disclosed. The caretaking burden category is a reality of advanced age that exists in most families. The knowledge category remains open in the absence of information about what Nancy may have known about the people in her life. The circumstantial category, by definition, cannot be identified until the full circumstances of that night are known. But what makes the elimination murder framework more compelling than the alternative explanations is not just the number of potential motives it accommodates. It is the behavioral signature it predicts. And that predicted signature matches the observable evidence in ways that the alternative explanations do not. Elimination murders are, definitionally and characteristically, staged. The perpetrator goes to substantial effort to create the appearance that a different kind of crime occurred, the appearance of a random home invasion, the appearance of a predatory stranger selecting a vulnerable target, the appearance of a burglary gone wrong. Because if the investigation classifies this event as a random, stranger-perpetrated violent crime, the person with actual motive, actual access, and actual knowledge of the victim's life remains in the category of people who are grieved and alarmed rather than suspects. Staging is not a forensic guarantee. It does not always work. But it is the operational logic of a specific category of perpetrator, the person who has to live, after the event, in proximity to the investigation, the person for whom distance from suspicion is not a convenience but a necessity. The panel asks the staging question directly about the Nancy Guthrie case. Does this crime scene, as described and analyzed, look more like a predatory stranger abduction, the execution of a specific, forensically complex crime type by someone motivated by profit or predatory impulse, or does it look more like a scene that was assembled to create that appearance? And the honest forensic answer, based on the evidence available to the panel, trends toward the second. A predatory stranger abduction of an adult from their home requires a specific set of conditions to be in place. The perpetrator must have selected this location, must have chosen this victim from the population of potential targets, must have conducted advanced surveillance sufficient to understand entry points, camera positions, occupant routines, and security characteristics, must have arrived with equipment and a plan designed to execute a crime of significant logistical complexity, the forcible, controlled removal of a living person who may resist, who may create noise, who may be medically fragile in ways that complicate transport. This is not a simple crime. It requires preparation, and preparation leaves traces. The behavioral record of this perpetrator does not show the signature of someone who arrived with that level of preparation. It shows someone improvising. It shows someone whose equipment does not fit together. Someone whose camera countermeasures are vegetation held in front of a lens. Someone who, in the direct assessment of the panel, is not sophisticated enough to fake one of the common reasons why somebody would break into a house, like robbery or sexual assault. The signs of a robbery gone wrong are not there. The signs of a sexual assault are not there. And that absence is itself a finding, not because it proves staging, but because it presents a pattern that is more consistent with staging than with the spontaneous development of a predatory stranger crime. The panel then asks the question that the elimination murder framework demands as a matter of investigative logic. Who, in the specific universe of people whose lives intersect with Nancy Guthrie's, benefits from her death or disappearance? Not who is suffering the most publicly, not who is most visibly devastated, but who, in the private accounting of motives and interests, has something different on the day after than they had on the day before. The panel does not answer that question. They cannot, without access to information that is held by law enforcement and by the family. But they frame it correctly. They insist that it must be asked. And they note that the universe of people for whom the answer is not nothing is not empty. The third possibility, alongside the accidental abduction theory and the elimination murder framework, is one that the panel discusses with a psychological precision that deserves careful attention. The possibility that this event was not primarily directed at Nancy Guthrie at all. That Nancy was, in the forensic sense, a means, a mechanism, and that the true target of this event is the person whose suffering was most certain to follow, Savannah Guthrie. The panel examines this possibility with appropriate rigor, and one member of the panel makes an observation that is uncomfortable but analytically necessary. Could the motive behind this event have been retribution toward Savannah, the desire to harm a person who is otherwise surrounded by resources, security, and professional visibility by harming the person she loves who is not? To cause a specific and irreplaceable category of suffering, the loss of a parent, under conditions that will never fully resolve, inflicted on a woman who cannot be reached in any other way. That is not a burglary motivation. It is not a kidnapping for ransom motivation. It is a motivation rooted in personal hatred of a specific and targeted kind. A hatred so deep and so specific in its object that its author was willing to commit a federal crime to deliver it, to absorb the risk of that crime, to plan and execute an event that their target would experience in perpetuity. But the panel immediately introduces a counterpoint that keeps the analysis honest. If the goal was retribution toward Savannah, if the point was to make her understand that this was personal, that it was punishment, that someone had reached her through the person she loves, then there is an expected behavioral consequence. The person who wants Savannah Guthrie to understand that this was directed at her needs her to understand it. Retribution, as a psychological category, is not satisfied by the suffering of a victim who does not know why they are suffering. The purpose of retribution is the knowledge of cause, the experiencing of accountability. And no one has taken credit. There has been no communication that unambiguously identifies this as a message to Savannah. There has been no statement of grievance, no declaration of purpose, no contact that says explicitly or implicitly this is because of you. The panel notes this absence. If retribution toward Savannah was the motive, the typical behavioral expectation is that the perpetrator wants her to know it, wants her to carry not just the grief of loss, but the specific and particular burden of knowing that her prominence, her choices, or her actions were the reason her mother was taken. That expectation is not met. Or at least, no publicly available information suggests it has been met. Unless the ongoing uncertainty is the communication. Unless the refusal to resolve this case, the absence of Nancy, the absence of answers, the open wound that cannot close because the question at its center cannot be answered, is itself the message. A communication that does not need to be explicit to be received. Because Savannah Guthrie said it herself. The idea that this could have been because of who she is, that statement, made publicly, by Savannah Guthrie, haunts her. She said so. That haunting is the delivery of the message. And the person who designed this event, if they designed it with Savannah as the intended recipient, would hear that, would read that, and would know that the message was received without ever having sent a word that said so directly. Now the question of connection. Who knew this home? Who knew this woman? Who had sufficient knowledge of the operational details, the camera positions, the entry points, the routines, the geography of the neighborhood to plan what was planned. The panel reaches a consensus on this point that is notable for its specificity. Someone involved in this event had operational knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's life and property, not theoretical knowledge. Not the kind of general awareness that comes from reading a news article or observing a neighborhood from a distance. Operational knowledge, the kind that only comes from proximity, from time spent inside the radius of this home, from access, legitimate or otherwise, to the spaces and patterns that constitute a person's daily existence. The starting point for understanding what that means is the home itself. Nancy Guthrie's residence had been occupied for years, possibly decades. A home occupied for that length of time accumulates a history of professional relationships, of maintenance, of repair, of the regular, routine, invisible access that keeps a residence functioning. Landscapers who know the property boundaries and the camera sightlines. HVAC technicians who know where the units are positioned and when they are serviced. Roofers who have been on the property, inside the perimeter, with a view of the surveillance infrastructure. Electricians, plumbers, cleaning services, home health aides. Delivery drivers who have visited regularly enough to understand patterns of presence and absence. None of these individuals are implicated by virtue of their professional access. That is not the analytical point. The analytical point is that the person responsible for this crime had sufficient familiarity with this specific property, its camera placement, its access points, the timing of its occupants' routines to plan what they planned. And that familiarity does not develop from a single reconnaissance pass. It develops from time, from access. From a history of presence inside the operational radius of this home that normalized their presence and made their observation unremarkable, the FBI is asking for the names of every contractor, every service worker, everyone who entered the neighborhood in January, not in the week before the event, in the month before it. That investigative scope reflects an understanding of what the behavioral evidence suggests, that whoever was responsible was not a stranger to this area. They were known to it. They moved within it with a comfort level that came from familiarity. And familiarity, in this context, is a forensic artifact. It is evidence of relationship, even if the nature of that relationship remains to be determined. One panelist introduces a concept that is worth dwelling on: the grudge collector. A grudge collector is not someone in a visible, active, recognized conflict with their target. A grudge collector does not announce their grievance. They do not create records, witnesses, or documentation of their hostility. They are, in most cases, entirely invisible in the social landscape of the person they have chosen as their object. A grudge collector is someone who experienced, or believed they experienced, something at the hands of another person, a slight, a dismissal, a perceived injustice, an insult that may have been entirely unintentional, and who carried it, privately, perhaps for months, perhaps for years, building a resentment that grew disproportionate to its origin, that calcified into something that people who knew its origin would struggle to recognize as related to that original encounter. Nancy Guthrie may have had no awareness that this person existed in relation to her, may have never given a second thought to whatever interaction planted the seed of their grievance. That is the nature of the grudge collector. They inhabit the margins. They exist in the periphery of their target's social world in ways the target never registers. An encounter on a television program watched by millions. A service interaction remembered by one side and forgotten by the other. A professional relationship, briefly intersecting, that left a mark on one person and left nothing on the other. There is a larger dimension to the connection question that the panel handles with appropriate care. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, and Savannah Guthrie has appeared on national television for decades. She is recognizable to an audience of millions. And that visibility, as it does for all people who exist publicly at that level, attracts a specific and documented subset of the population that develops a distorted relationship with the image they consume. Parasocial relationships, the one-directional attachments that viewers develop toward figures. They watch, but never interact with, personally are not inherently pathological. Most people navigate them without difficulty. But within the population of people who develop parasocial attachments to public figures, a small subset develops those attachments in ways that become fixed, that intensify rather than dissipate over time, and that can, in extreme cases, generate a felt sense of grievance when the parasocial relationship is disrupted, or when the public figure does something the viewer experiences as a personal betrayal. In that scenario, Nancy Guthrie was not selected because of who she is as an individual. She was selected because of whose mother she is, because she represented the most vulnerable, most accessible point in the orbit of a person who is otherwise effectively unreachable. The panel holds this possibility with appropriate scientific caution. One member notes that the Savannah Guthrie connection could just be the world's weirdest coincidence, that this case, despite its high-profile dimensions, may ultimately have an explanation entirely unrelated to Savannah's prominence. That observation is epistemically responsible. Confirmation bias is a genuine investigative hazard. The most prominent feature of a case is not necessarily the most causally relevant one, but against that qualifier sits the weight of the alternatives. If this is not about Savannah, then it is about Nancy. Specifically, personally, for reasons that are rooted in her life, her relationships, her history, and the specific people who moved through it over 84 years of living. That circle is not infinite. It is finite. It is mappable. And it contains, within it, the answer that the investigation is looking for. One dimension of this case that has been consistently underweighted in public analysis is the ongoing nature of the uncertainty, and the panel addresses this with a clinical directness that compounds the horror of the situation rather than diminishing it. Not knowing is not a neutral psychological state. It is an active condition, one that generates a specific and identifiable category of suffering that is, in important ways, more resistant to resolution than grief itself. Grief has a trajectory. It responds, however slowly and imperfectly, to time, to ritual, to the eventual hard-won acceptance of what cannot be changed. Not knowing does not respond to any of those processes. It is recursive. It is open-ended. It is resistive to closure because the question at its center, what happened and why and where, remains open. The family of Nancy Guthrie is living in that condition. Every day. Not because the investigation has failed, but because the answer has not yet been found. And the panel makes a point about this that is, when stated plainly, deeply disturbing. If the intent behind this event was to cause Savannah Guthrie maximum suffering over maximum time, the ongoing uncertainty is not a failure of the plan. It may be the plan. An abduction that resolves through a ransom payment, through the recovery of remains, through an arrest and a trial gives the family something to hold. Even in the worst possible outcome, there is an endpoint. A fact that can be confronted, however devastating. A process that has a beginning and, eventually, a conclusion. An abduction that does not resolve gives them nothing but the open question. And the open question cannot be answered by grief, by memorial, by time, by the ordinary human mechanisms for processing loss, because it is not loss in the ordinary sense. It is suspension. Permanent suspension in the moment before the answer arrives. And a person who designed this event with sufficient sophistication to understand that dynamic is not a burglar, not an opportunist, not someone who stumbled into a situation and made a catastrophic decision in a moment of panic. That is someone who understood, before the event, what its aftermath would feel like, who factored the aftermath into the plan, who is, in some way, continuing to benefit from what they set in motion. This is where the two primary theories the panel holds converge in their investigative implications, even though they diverge in their description of what happened. The first theory, an attempt at a crime, possibly theft, possibly something more personal that went catastrophically wrong. Someone entered with an intention. The 42 minutes of footage represents the execution of that intention, or its aftermath. And somewhere in those 42 minutes, or in the time before the cameras were aware of the intrusion, Nancy Guthrie experienced a cardiac event or some other acute medical crisis that altered the situation beyond anything the perpetrator had planned for. They panicked. They made decisions that compound the original event. They removed her. They disappeared. And the subsequent communications, including the note that says, "I am sorry." We did not expect her heart to be that weak, reflect the disorganized aftermath of a person who did not anticipate the medical dimension of what they were doing to an 84-year-old woman. The second, theory, a deliberate act, an elimination, staged to look like the first scenario. Someone, perhaps not the person on camera, perhaps someone operating at a remove of 1 or more degrees who wanted Nancy Guthrie gone, for reasons that are personal, specific, and rooted in a relationship or a history that has not fully surfaced. Who understood that the appearance of a predatory stranger abduction would direct investigative attention away from the population of people with actual motive, and who is now existing, somewhere within reachable proximity to this investigation, behind a screen of normalcy that has held so far. Both scenarios eliminate the same category of suspect. Both scenarios point away from the random, opportunistic predator with no prior connection to Nancy Guthrie or her home. Both scenarios point toward someone for whom this location, this woman, and this family were not chosen from an anonymous pool but were specifically selected, because of what they represented, because of what they provided access to, because of what their disappearance would deliver to whoever made the decision to make them disappear. This case is not closed. Every subscriber to this channel, every person who shares this video, every like that pushes this content toward a wider audience, all of it is a signal that this story has not been abandoned. Hit the like button now. Share this video. Subscribe to True Crime Hex if you have not already. Every action you take extends the reach of this coverage, and extending that reach is the most direct thing anyone outside the investigation can do to ensure that this case stays in the consciousness of people who might hold the key to what happened. We are watching. We are not letting go of this story, and we will not stop until there are answers. The panel does not close with certainty, and certainty, in the absence of a confession or a prosecution, is not available. What is available is direction. The conclusion of this analysis, reached by 3 of the most credentialed forensic minds who have examined this case, is not that the answer is unknown. It is that the answer is almost certainly not where the most public attention has been directed. The answer is not in a database of predatory strangers who randomly select elderly women from their homes in the middle of the night. It is not in the population of professional criminals who execute kidnapping for ransom operations against targets with no prior assessment of their financial capacity to pay. It is not in the abstract, anonymous universe of people who might do something like this to anyone. It is in the population of people who knew this home, who knew this woman, who had or believed they had a reason that was specific and personal, who had time to observe and plan, who had a motive that the Elimination murder framework accommodates in one or more of its 5 documented categories, and who, after what happened, had sufficient composure to manage the aftermath with a degree of control that the camera footage suggests was not accidental. That circle is finite. It has boundaries that can be established by methodical investigation of Nancy Guthrie's life, her relationships, her financial situation, her history of contact with service professionals, her connections within the community, the people who knew her as themselves and the people who knew her as Savannah Guthrie's mother. Somewhere within that circle, there is a person who knows what happened, who has known since the morning of the 1st of February 2025, who has watched the coverage, the memorials, the press conferences, the reward announcements, who has perhaps sent communications that law enforcement is still working to authenticate and trace, and who is, with every passing day, calculating whether the distance between themselves and the investigation is holding. It may be holding, but it is not infinite. Investigations of this kind, with the level of resources, the federal involvement, and the forensic evidence that this case has generated, do not resolve in weeks. They resolve in months and years. They resolve when a single piece of trace evidence becomes readable, when a communication is finally authenticated, when a financial record surfaces that connects a person to a timeline, when someone, in the orbit of the person responsible, realizes what they know and decides that the weight of knowing it is more than they can carry. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She was taken from her home on a night when the temperature in the Catalina foothills dropped to cold. She was taken without her shoes, and she has not been found. Her family wakes up every morning in the grip of a question that has no answer yet. And the person who has that answer, who has always had that answer, is somewhere, living with what they know, calculating whether what they have done is discoverable. This is True Crime Hex. We stay until there are answers. We will not look away.